Well, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you also, Ms. Özdemir, for the storytelling, because it brings us exactly to the 3M session, Migration, Myths and Messages. And I think you send a wonderful message here, right there, but it will also be the question, how can this be framed, how can this be used? And we have 4 excellent myth-busters with us. Here I have Kully Kaur-Ballagan. She is head of the Race, Faith and Cohesion Unit at the Ipsos MORI Social Research Institute. She has a long time in quantitative and qualitative research methods, also on hard-to-reach audiences like refugees and asylum seekers. Prior, she worked for a number of British government departments and public bodies, like the Foreign and the Home Office, so we'll make sure to also ask you about that, because her statement is, well, policymakers do follow polls, even if they say they don't. Then, here I have Shikha Dalmia. She's a senior policy analyst at the Reason Foundation in Detroit. The Reason Foundation is a non-profit think tank to advance free minds and free markets, and she sure is a free mind. She said, I have lots of opinions, so she's a regular contributor to op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journals, LA Times, and the Business Week. And she says her job is to constantly counter myths that people have who have not seen immigrants. So someone maybe in Hamel. Then I have Ramon, Sanahuja. He's a director of immigration and interculturality at the city of Barcelona in Spain since 2011. And he has been running and operating what a lot of you might have heard already about or heard rumors about, the anti-rumor campaign. How many of you are familiar with that? A few, okay. So at the end, all will raise their hand and hopefully also wanting to transfer it. So the anti-rumor campaign was started with the beginning of 2011, so you can really give us some good insights. Before that, he was the director of Immigration and International Cooperation Department, where he was responsible for the Barcelona Intercultural Plan. And, well, Ramon says facts by itself are not enough. You have to appeal to the emotions. So a report or messages have to be also put together, and maybe that will convince the people of Hameln. And then last but not least, we have Doug Saunders. You have made many appearances throughout this conference already, so I don't really need to further introduce you. You're the author and international affairs columnist, and the reason why you're also on this panel is, of course, because of your book, The Myth of the Muslim Tide. And you should not have told me that, but you were actually in Switzerland before the referendum, but you weren't able to persuade the 19,000 voters that were needed. But we can maybe talk. You tried, okay. Maybe we can hear more why you think that wasn't really so helpful, or why you weren't able to succeed with Switzerland. The way we want this session to work is really have a brief conversation among us here first on 3 stages. Well, first is the myths, the rumors, and the skepticisms. What are the roots? What are the origins? And how does that also connect to pollsters? What can they tell us about people of Hameln, about the 60%, the persuadables maybe? And what are then, to move on to, what are some actual strategies to bust myths? What role does the media play? What other incentives could be there? What other strategies? But then also, because Ratna tasked us at the beginning, really take one thing from this conference that you want to carry on after the conference. And maybe you can find one thing also from this panel. So we want to see, well, how can we transfer some of what we have heard here, or what would be your advice to people wanting to implement some of the cities, be it in Hameln or in other cities? So that's for our structure. The first question is to you, Doug, actually. So you have spent plenty of time now when you were also researching for your book, and about myths, about the rumors, about the skepticisms. What have you learned? What are the drivers for these myths that you have heard? And if you could tell us a little bit about that.
When you come to believe an idea about people around you, it seems that all the evidence around you seems to support this. And I'm in part a guilty party here. I am not just a writer, but also an editor with a major newspaper. I think when we start hearing some of the Ipsos results, we'll learn things like, for example, that most people think a third of all refugees and asylum seekers in the world are living in their country, whereas in fact it's about 2% and things like this. And that is in large part because what we put on our front pages is bad news about refugees and asylum seekers. And as you suggested, what you hear that there's something called a confirmation bias, which is that when you believe something, you notice the things that confirm your belief more than the things that refute your belief. And let me just let's step back a bit. If you had been in the United States or Canada in the year 1950, it would have been very common for many people around you to believe that a certain immigrant group were threatening the country, that they had a religion that was not so much a religion as an ideology of conquest, that they were forming communities isolated from everyone else, sending their kids to religious schools separately, that they were having 7 or 8 children each. They had become a majority in some cities and soon would be a majority elsewhere, and had a plan to, they voted as a bloc and they had a plan to impose their religious authority over the country. And these were the Roman Catholics from Southern Europe. The best-selling book in the United States in 1949 and 1950 was called American Freedom and Catholic Power. And it argued that Catholic immigrants were naturally violent, were associated with crime and extremism, and that they had a plan to impose their politics on the country through reproduction and so on. And that if they weren't careful by 1960, there could be a Catholic president of the United States. And to most people, a lot of people didn't believe this. I mean, everybody's uncle seemed to believe this, but most people poo-pooed it. But it was a popular enough idea, and a lot of people were unwilling to dismiss it because everything around you seemed to confirm it. Catholic immigrants at that point were all coming from countries that had fallen prey to fascism or extremism. Most organized crime in North America was Catholic immigrants. The 2 largest acts of terrorism in the United States to that point, the bombing of Wall Street and the assassination of a president, had been committed by immigrants from Catholic countries that had fallen to fascism. And they did indeed, they had poverty rates that were poor, literacy rates that were poor, they self-segregated, and so on. Every piece of evidence around you would seem to support that hypothesis of the Catholic tide, and so on. In fact, it was only really the election of a Catholic president in 1960 that helped erase and eliminate that particular thing. So this tells us 2 things. First of all, our confirmation biases are powerful and they work and they've worked over and over again. But second of all, that we can get past these things, that a myth can exist throughout the whole population that seems to be supported by every fact, and a generation later it can have completely disappeared, as this one did.
In your book, it's a follow-up question, but in your book, the Myth of the Muslim Tide, you start out by saying, well, actually, I took a walk through my neighborhood, and I noticed that it has changed, and that it had changed quite a fair bit, and that aroused certain reactions to you, and that you said, well, sometimes I can relate to what some people might be feeling. So how is the emotional aspect of change also, of course, playing into this?
I've been as fallible to these ideas as anyone else. I've always lived among immigrants, usually from poorer places. But certainly in the years of the 2000s when I was living in London, I came to look askance at some of my neighbors, no question. And it seemed reasonable. I mean, my local mosque was called the Finsbury Park Mosque, and it was overtaken by an Al-Qaeda affiliate, became very extremist. One of my neighbors lost her legs to the July 7th, 2005 London Underground bombings. There were extremists in my neighborhood. So even though my family physician was a Pakistani Muslim, even though my kids' friends had names like Osama and things like this, and some of my best friends ... and all that, certainly, if I was on the bus and the guy with the beard and the backpack was across from me, I wouldn't think, oh, he looks like one of my son's friends. I'd think, how do I get off this bus quickly if I need to, and so on. And I was willing to take the ideas of the populist right seriously enough to consider them. Well, what if there is we've fought for generations very hard to only recently win equal rights for homosexuals, equal rights for women, birth control rights, and so on. What if there is a population in our midst who are in large numbers and don't support those hard-fought rights, who are opposed to them, whose children and grandchildren will also be opposed to them, and who are reproducing in such great numbers that they'll become a majority and reverse those. At least I was willing to entertain that. And I thought one of the reasons why I thought I needed to write this book was because I had realized through scholarship and through observing the facts that none of that was true. But it's not self-evident that none of that's true. That if somebody with liberal background, could come to be worried about this prospect, then it seemed reasonable to write that. So yeah, I mean, in a way, it was a book written for Islamophobes by an Islamophobe, if you will, you know.
Well, but I mean, Khalid Kosar in the beginning, he tasked us to also, engage with the facts, but also, and also to, of course, figure out what are the sensible issues in the migration debate and not to shy away from that, but also, of course, to tell the positive side stories, but the balance is always the right thing. Maybe I can turn to you, Kully, and ask you, well, what do you know about those skeptics or people who, they might see what is changing around them, but they might not have read Doug's book, nor know what is actually going on. Can you tell us a little bit about them when you do your polls?
Okay, I think, first of all, I'd just like to start by saying, we talk about myths, and we in this room are probably quite a sophisticated audience in our understanding about migration and immigration. But in the polling that we do, I think some of people's concerns aren't actually myths. What people tell us are actually genuinely reflections of their concerns. For example, we in the UK do something called the Issues Index, which we've been tracking since the late 70s. And it asks people, what's the most important issue facing Britain? It's unprompted, they can say whatever they want. And what we've mapped over the years, that immigration, we weren't always actually worried about it. And in the late 90s, mid to late 1990s in the UK, this issue started creeping up quite rapidly. Now, if you map that against net flows of migration into the UK, there's actually a very close relationship. So, it's not just these myths, they are probably rooted in something fairly genuine change that people are seeing. Nevertheless, there is quite a massive misperception about people's views on immigration. As Doug was saying, that last year we asked people, what proportion of the British population do you think are foreign born? And people, the average was 31%. The reality is it's about 13%. And we would say, well, why do you say 31%? Well, we don't believe the official statistics. There's lots of illegal people coming in. They're not counted in those official statistics. And I think that says a lot about sort of disenfranchisement with the political system, lack of trust in the political system. And I think the other thing that we see is at the local level, when you ask people, how much of a problem is immigration in your local area, when you walk around, what do you see? People say, yeah, it is a problem. About 1 in 5 people say it's a problem. But at the national level, we're being swamped. 75% people say it's a problem in Britain. So there is a real disconnect between what people see happening locally, i.e. probably very little change, unless you maybe live in the large urban centres where you're used to seeing change. Whereas at the national level, they do rely on things like the media, what they hear, and maybe that's what's fueling some of their perceptions and misperceptions. I think polling can't tell us the whole story, so we do need to get under the sort of skin of some of these concerns. And is it about wider disengagement, wider mistrust? But I think what polling does do and what it does show is it brings the sort of issues to the forefront. And I also think, in the UK, maybe sort of policymakers have been quite slow on the mark in tackling the pro-immigration narrative because they've been a bit scared. And also, unfortunately, it's sort of left us in a situation now where the negative narrative is quite strong and no one's really come up with a convincing national kind of debate about it or conversation about it.
Thank you. And have you in your polls also encountered that, sometimes the opinion was better than the policymakers thought? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, I think people are. I think when you talk about who migrants are and immigrants are, I think the knee-jerk reaction is asylum seekers. They're all here to take, kind of benefit tourism. But actually, when you sort of dig a bit deeper and say, well, this, sort of the large proportion of people coming into the UK now, non-EU migrants, are students, highly skilled workers, or here for family reunification. Actually, people's views are quite positive about that.
Well, thank you, and also for highlighting that when people are asked about their local environment, actually their perceptions are different than when they have to make judgments for the national level. Can you tell us also a little bit about the age groups, about the other parameters?
Yeah, I mean, the people who tend to be more negative about immigration and their views, and the people who really want to sort of see, reductions in numbers, tend to be older, white, pre-war, sort of generation. There is a massive generational difference in actually people sort of, we call generation X or Y, basically born in the 70s and 80s onwards, tend to be a lot more positive about immigration. And, not to say that there aren't concerns among that age group, but there is a very big generational divide.
Thank you. So I'm now turning to this side. So now you've heard, well, there are, some misperceptions, some anxieties. There are polls that also dig deeper into the perceptions. How do you, as an opinion or an op-ed writer, deal with that? Do you take up polls? Is that something that where you put out facts? Is that something that convinces people? And what's your task with it?
Thank you. Is this on? Can you? Yeah, to back up a little and just pick up from what Doug was talking about, it is absolutely true that the conversation about immigration in the United States has always been hot and passionate. My foundation actually produces a magazine called Reason Magazine, and a few years ago we'd done this issue about, a historical issue looking back at what the immigration debate looked like, at the turn of the last century. And we found these cartoons from a very, very well-read magazine at that time, which was called WASP, a name that is kind of unimaginable in this day and age, which ran cartoons about immigrants coming from actually China and other Asian countries. And they had like this sea of like riffraff is what they call them, washing across the Statue of Liberty. And there were captions saying, this one is carrying leprosy, this one is carrying this disease, and that. And so if you look at the immigration debate from this historical perspective, you actually see we've kind of made progress on this. That, there isn't a magazine called WASP that exists now. There is a way in which, there are some terms that we actually don't use for immigrants anymore. So there has, the discussion about immigration, even in these polarized times, has become fairly, much more civil. Now, if you take a narrower slice of time, which is the last 20, 25 years, that's where the polarization has really occurred. The strange thing about the United States, which is where I've lived for the last 30 years almost, is that it has this mythology about being a nation of immigrants, and yet its specific myths don't always buttress that mythology. So it has it, if you ask Americans, do you think immigration has been good for the country? And 70% will tell you, yes, it's been good for the country. And then you ask them about, well, what about more immigration from China or India, where have you? Well, we can't have that because they'll take away our jobs. So there's always been something of this schizophrenia in, in the debate in the United States. And lately, actually, the reason things have got polarized is that, the media has become fairly fragmented. Doug talked about confirmation bias. People can go to whichever venue supports their instincts, their positions. So, if you are to the right, and if you don't like immigration, you have Rush Limbaugh, and if you like immigration, then you can go to MSNBC, and the two sides, never really talk to each other. So, I work for a think tank, and my main job is writing columns. I really try to do do the hard thing that Doug was talking about, which is, I have certain normative commitments. I'm for free mobility across borders. I am for better protection of immigration rights and what have you. But there is a time to express these normative commitments, and there is a time not to express these normative commitments. If you carry these normative commitments on your sleeve, what happens is you are not really listening to the other side. And they might have some very valid concerns that you need to address. You have to be able to address their concerns on their own terms if you're going to move the debate forward. So to talk about one specific myth which has been extremely powerful in the United States, and it has basically stalled the conversation about reform on the undocumented immigrant issue, and the trope that has been really popular is, well, these unskilled workers from Mexico, they are illegal immigrants. They have not stood in a queue the way they should. They have jumped a queue. They should go back to their country and like wait over there and wait their turn, like other immigrants do. And if they don't, we are just subverting our rule of law. Now, this has been a really, really powerful argument and makes a certain amount of sense that if, a country's laws are not going to be obeyed, what kind of country is this going to be? You're going to have complete mayhem and anarchy. The problem with this argument is, and for anybody who has gone through the US immigration system, this is like, this is driven home to them, that there is a queue for skilled workers, the professionals. However, there is no queue. There is no process to let unskilled immigrants into the country and then give them permanent residency. Now, making this clear to American people and their sense and appealing to their sense of fairness is just extremely, extremely important. You can't simply turn around and tell them, you are fascists because you want to keep these people out. You can't tell them that you're racist. You have to argue with them on their own terms. And that at least is, usually my attempt.
Do you find that in your reporting, this also trickles down to your language? Because language can be so powerful, especially for the media representatives. And you have a certain responsibility on the one hand to not use certain terms. On the other hand, you pointed out, well, you have to speak the language. And someone, a psychologist once said in a messaging session, actually, to advocates, he said, well, if you're using the language that you're using with me, also pro-migration person, then you're not doing your job, because you need to figure out how to talk and what words to use that appeal to the other side, even though you might not like it. Is that something that you find yourself sometimes in, or?
Yeah, I do struggle with that a little bit. On the one hand, to take the, one particular example of this term, illegal immigrants, which has become an extremely controversial term in the United States. On one hand, it's a completely inaccurate term to describe the situation, right? There is no such thing as illegal immigrants. I would prefer to call them paperless workers, because that's what they really are. If you need to have a modifier before a person, there is something wrong with our category. If somebody comes and asphyxiates, you with a pillow, we don't call them illegal asphyxiator. We call them a murderer. The fact that we don't have a term for, to describe illegal immigrants tells you that there is something wrong with our definition. On the other hand, I use the term illegal immigrant in my own columns, because the way the debate has worked is you have this activist community which carries its normative commitments on its sleeves, and then you have the other side which is suspicious of this activist community. How do you cross the barrier? At times, it's useful to use the term illegal immigrant so as not to be simply tuned out by the people whom you need to reach out to. If you don't, if you insist on a certain vocabulary and a certain terminology, you can very easily be branded, oh, she's this politically correct liberal who doesn't know, doesn't understand my concerns and is not listening to me. So I think, it is important, even as you're trying to change the terms of the debate and change the narrative, at the same time, be sort of strategic in how you use these terms and how you communicate them. I really don't think there ought to be some kind of like a blanket rule that we are never going to use one particular term or we are going to use another term.
Okay, I'll actually turn it to you in a minute, though. I'm being impolite and getting back to the pollsters, though, because the question on the language, sometimes pollsters, and we do public opinion polls too, and we're always accused, well, if you use the term illegal immigrant, for example, then you're creating a social reality, because it sticks with people's heads, it's about the messaging. Is that something that comes up in your work as well, and that you have to be careful of? Because questions, the way you phrase them, will lead to different results. We all know that.
Yeah. Absolutely. We have to be very careful, and it's our responsibility as pollsters. We need to be careful about the language we use. But I do know that even with the term migrant and immigrant, it's still quite, certainly in the UK, quite a loaded word. Also people here come to work. If you talk about that, people are much more positive. People come from the EU. But when we do unpick, what do you mean by immigrant? And actually, a core of people do think illegal immigration, when you unpick it, and far fewer people say students, that's actually the largest group of immigrants to the UK, students. They don't really mention that. The things that stick in their mind are the asylum seekers, the illegal immigrants, of which actually in the UK there are very, very few because it's so difficult to get into the UK. So yes, I think the language is very, it can be very powerful, and you have to be very careful about how you use that.
We'll come to the next stage in a minute, and that is actually how can you use those results to move the discussion forward. But I want to turn now to the more local context after Hameln. We're also now in Barcelona, and here you started the anti-rumor campaign, which has really taken up quite a fair bit of interest also. How, now sticking with the first theme, how did you identify the rumors that were existing, and also getting to the concerns that the people in Barcelona had?
Yes, mainly the rumors were identified because the grassroots organizations came to the city municipality, and they show concern about what we're hearing around in the neighborhoods. They were really worried, even inside their organizations. Many of the members of these grassroots organizations with a past of fight and liberal fight, and they were also repeating these arguments they were hearing all around the neighborhood. So this drew our attention, and then we focus on this issue because these rumors, the problem with the rumors is that rumors, especially false rumors, they are based on false facts. They come before prejudice, and then afterwards, prejudice comes discrimination. That's the action. Rumors, perhaps it's only something that we have here, but at the end can bring discrimination. So this is very, very difficult. So through talking with NGOs, with grassroots organizations, we identified a list of rumors. I can give you some examples. For example, migrants do not pay taxes. Migrants like to live piled in houses. Migrants are not civic. Migrants are not educated. Migrants receive all grants. They monopolize all grants of the public administration. Migrants collapse the health and public security, social security system. Migrants, Chinese migrants, for example, they don't respect the hours of closing and opening hours of the shops. And there's many others. And these are just examples. And
so now we're moving. So now you've identified those rumors, and they might exist in all of our cities, in all of our countries, and it doesn't matter where we are. Those rumors, and also the biases. Connecting to this morning session, we all have biases. So of course, identifying that is a first step, and also admitting to it, but also hearing that it exists in your city and in the community. So now we could say, well, we've identified those rumors. You do your research, you do your research. We know the facts. That's actually not true. Well, you say, well, the perception actually says, well, they think it's true though. So what do we do? Maybe you can tell us what you started to do. Is it something where the mayor of Hameln just says, look, people, this is not right. Here are the facts.
Okay. I think there are three possible ways. First of all, we need data. It's important to have the data, because even us, we were not sure about what they were. Perhaps this neighbor is right. He's expressing that I don't get the grant because the grant goes to this black family there, and I got out of the. Perhaps it's true. I don't know. Let's study the data. Okay, the data show that was not true. It was not true. So first of all, data inside the public administration, which is not always easy to gather this data. Then deliver the data, okay? But as I said, delivering data by itself is useless. It's okay, you need it, but by itself, it doesn't go to the minds of the people. So you need a strategy to deliver this information. So you have to use, for example, who is going to deliver this information. If I do it as Ramon, Director of Immigration, I don't have credibility. People say, oh, come on, Ramon, what do you have to say? You're the Director of Immigration. So we have to identify who delivers the data. For example, in neighborhoods, there are always respected people. So we have to identify these people. Maybe it's the pharmacist, maybe it's the priest, whoever. And we can deliver this information. We can they can repeat this information to the public, and it has legitimacy. What we lack, public administrations, we don't have legitimacy. And instead, there are a lot of people from the NGOs, from just normal people who have more legitimacy, but they didn't have the information. So we had to produce and deliver this information to them in order to deliver to the rest of the city. This is why we created a figure, we invented a figure, which is the anti-rumor agent. Okay, it's a person who volunteers to act in the daily life to break these rumors. Okay, it's not a full-time job. It's just you can do it when you hear a rumor, you can act it. You can do it in your normal life, in your work, in your association, etc. And the final thing is we had a choice. We could spend the money in a big campaign with the media, with TV ads, or we could do a face-to-face campaign. Okay, so we decide to go for the face-to-face campaign. So this is why we use these anti-rumor agents, and as well, as I said, we use other kind of tactics. For example, humor. Humor is important, and appealing to feelings is also important. Try to use some kind of ideas that for the other person, like in this morning we learned, we have to share things, we have to be in common with the other, we have to engage, as you said, I don't know who was, you said, I think we have to be able to engage with this person who is expressing fear, okay? We cannot accuse him of being racist at the first thing. No. Let's discuss. Let's do it in an equal way. Let's see if we can plant the seed of the doubt in his brain. That's the objective.
And I think you mentioned a very important, two important aspects. One is the face-to-face, so the actual contact and interaction, and that you need to have champions in the community that spread the message, because otherwise, you said also before in another conversation, well, if I'm Ramon, if I'm from the city, people won't believe me. So you need someone like Ms. Özdemir to say, well, look, here I am. You need the storytelling to actually have the authenticity. But you also use the NGOs a lot for the anti-rumor agents, and you develop them as ambassadors. Can you maybe explain a little bit how that works, and can we all become ambassadors?
Yes, well, I think this is how we organize in our city. Every city can do it, but I think they have to find their own way to do it. It's not the same. Barcelona, we have a big, very rich social tissue. So it was kind of easy at the beginning to engage really NGOs who were activist NGOs on the field of welcoming policies or anti-discrimination. But this was not enough because we wanted to reach all kinds of NGOs or all kinds of organizations like for example, teachers or organization of shop tenders or neighborhoods organizations, not only the ones who are already convinced. So what we did is we offer what we call training. Okay, it's a training of 12 hours. And we engage these people, and who passes this training, he is officially, he's labeled as an official anti-rumor agent, okay, and becomes one of the persons who is engaged on this campaign. And these campaigns are growing and growing, and more people is coming, more different people. We're getting really to doctors in hospitals and in students and teachers in schools, so it is really, really interesting.
Well, thank you. And I know that we already have an active panel wanting to come in. We'll do that in a minute. And then we'll also actually, I want to leave at least 20-25 minutes for discussion with the audience. But you mentioned humor. You had with the topic of Islamophobia, I don't know, is that a topic where you actually can employ humor?
Yes.
I mean, does okay.
Yes, in fact. I think we need to understand what it means to win an argument. When you win an argument, it's not that the person you're arguing with suddenly says, yeah, you're right and I'm wrong, and so on. That never happens. In fact, usually if it comes to that, it's when they're driving away and giving you the finger, and that means you've lost the argument. I think anybody who has had an argument with a spouse or a romantic partner will know that the point, there's a British writer who once said, there comes a point in any argument with your spouse where you realize you're going to have to decide whether you want to be right or you want to be happy. And arguing about immigration with larger groups of the public, I think, is a lot like that as well. The point when you've won an argument is not that you've yelled at someone that they're racist and they're wrong and they finally give up and say, oh yeah, you're right, I am. It's the point when you disagree, they still hate you, but 2 days later they're doing exactly what you'd like them to be doing. And we will not persuade people by telling them that they're bigoted or prejudiced, or that they're looking at it wrong, or that there's no such thing as an illegal immigrant, or that theirs is a religion of peace, or anything like that. You need to talk on people's terms. You need to treat their fears and concerns as not just being legitimate, but actually being real. And you have to be willing to lose as well. And it will work. In part, it works because the people who we think aren't on our side are on our side very often. We've seen something happen during the last 10 years, which is quite unusual and quite unexpected, but quite optimistic, which is that the parties of the right have begun to race against each other to become the parties of the immigrant. The Canadian Conservative Party spends which is a very right-wing Conservative Party. It was part of the right-wing populist movement that took over the old Conservative Party. It spends all of its time trying to embrace Muslims and Hindus and Tamils and Serbians and Ukrainians and so on, to get them to become the supporters of their party, because it realized that immigrants, and especially religious minority immigrants, are conservatives, that they are economic conservatives because they tend to be small business people, that they are social conservatives because they tend to be religious. The British Conservative Party made a big effort, even changing its foreign policy to try to become the party of the Asian vote, with less success because it also had a right-wing thing it wanted to do. Angela Merkel here spent the last election that's just been finished doing some very interesting things to try to get the Turco-German vote onto side, including embracing the idea of dual citizenship and so on. So we've reached a point where these ideas have been in the air long enough that the people who are opposed to them are actually doing the things that that work in the opposite direction. The point when this argument's been won is not when people like us are all going to be happy and feel like it's a utopia. It's the point when the worst is no longer being done.
I don't know how many people of you actually know Canadian TV shows, but is the Little Mosque on the Prairie, is that still on? Or do people know what it is? It's actually it's a comedy. A Little Mosque on the Prairie obviously is a reference to, this Midwestern town, but here you have a Muslim community and congregation, and it really depicts how you can use humor to overcome some of your biases that you have, and we all have, as we also know. Is that something? How is it received?
That show's sort of part of a new generation thing. I wish it was funnier, but it's being broadcast in the United States now too. And Little Mosque on the Prairie is sort of a second generation example of immigrant culture, and it indicates some of the change that's happened in the way these things have happened, which is that a lot of the dialogue in Canada during the previous generation was a shouting match between people who advocated multiculturalism and people who were opposed to it. And Canada had a law called official multiculturalism. And it's just about one of the few countries that ever actually has I always found it funny when British and German and French leaders went on about multiculti and this threat, when there in fact had never been any effort by either any government of any of these countries or any major immigrant group to advocate multiculturalism. And what that show is sort of a second generation show. And one of the things we realized is that the children of immigrants don't really like multiculturalism as a concept. They like to be able to have whatever culture they have. They like their culture to be changing from decade to decade. They like to be able to choose their affinities and interests and so on. They don't want to be defined as the Indian or as the Arab or something like that. They would rather not be fixed into those categories. In a way, they're in favor of the multi, but not the culturalism. And that's another part of the change is that people needed to realize that the shouting match has become about different terms. It's not about multiculturalism versus uniculturalism. In many ways, the arguments about cultures have taken on a new meaning, and you no longer need to have a fight about that particular thing.
Okay, and it's more also the values that people adhere to, and you alluded to that, and I'll actually turn to you. How, and then to Ramon, to lead us into, well, what is the outset for cities of, not cities of migration, but the anti-rumor campaign and how it can be transferred. But first I would like to know from you, I mean, how does media, we've now heard, well, we've had the storytelling, we've heard about humor, it can actually be used. How do you in the media then see the role? Sometimes media is always tasked to, or task themselves to just put out what's negative. And positive notes always seen, well, it's too glossy, too positive. Is that something that you get as a writer as well? That people complain and say, you're not getting it?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm an opinion writer, and my job is to piss people off. So I, get that a lot from them. But yeah, one way to again, to use the United States as an example, and it has this mythology of the land of immigrants. Now, but as Doug pointed out, this is, if it were consistent with its own ideology, you would have seen that the United States was the single line trajectory to ever greater, openness on the border. It doesn't work like that. Yesterday's immigrants are today's restrictionists. So the Catholics who came in, at the middle of the 20th century or before that, turned restrictionist against, other ethnic groups, and they had valid concerns. Now, the way do you, the question about how do you use data, everybody has data. It's not like the people on the other side, restrictionists, don't have data. They have lots of good studies that they can point to as well. So how do you sort out these competing, sets of facts and this competing set of data that are out there? One way to think, the one way to do it is to understand that, nobody's normative commitments are completely airtight and without internal tensions between them. To take the example of, and you can position your data, at those tension points to achieve results. So to take the example of welfare and immigration. Now, the concern about welfare stems from broader fiscal concerns about debts and entitlements and what have you, and people simply can't see, how do you bring in more people into this country, especially at the low skill level, and allow them to collect welfare and still meet your obligations. It's not an irrational question. Now, I have actually gone blue in my face pointing out that actually, 66% of undocumented workers actually pay taxes. Their economic contributions are far greater than, what they take away from the economy, from what they consume in the economy. Does not make any difference. One time I was actually giving a speech to a student group, and somebody asked me this question, well, yeah, I would be completely in favor of your commitment to open borders or freer mobility, if we could find a way to stop immigrants from collecting welfare. So immigration, yes, welfare, no. And so I looked at that person, I said, you realize that 66% of these people pay taxes. What you are basically saying is, we want to take your taxes. We don't want to give you the right to vote because we will block you from getting citizenship, and we will not give you welfare. Does that strike you as fair? This idea, one of the bedrock principles of your own worldview is no taxation without representation. Now you are, violating your own principle by your own position. And that completely, that caused him to think for 2 minutes. That, I'm in favor of free mobility, I'm in favor of freedom, equality, and limited government. And yet, what I am doing is empowering the government to use these people as a tax base without extending them any rights.
So and were you able to convince him?
Yeah, I mean, actually that student did come to me, later on and said, I'm not sure I buy your position, but you did, give me something to chew on.
Okay,
and
so
which is really the most you can expect in these situations.
So facts can change perceptions, and so maybe you can tell us. I mean, you said, well, facts can't really change perception unless they also appeal to emotion. And I think your example is also good because you appealed to values. You appeal to the fairness, and I think this is those are common values that everyone can understand and adhere to. So can you tell us now? We heard about Hameln. We're all here facing the city of Hameln. How could they implement the anti-rumor campaign? What factors would need to be there in order to do that? Or
Okay, first of all, I would say they have to have a framework on the approach of cultural diversity. Okay, Anti-Rumors campaign is only one program. I mean, you have a framework. In our case, it's interculturality. We conceive the city of Barcelona a place where interaction among diverse citizens may happen. Okay, that means thanks to assuring equal rights to everybody, respecting diversity, but specifically doing things in order to foster interaction. Rumors challenge interaction because you don't want to relate with a diverse person because based on this false idea. So we have to fight this. So this is not just something we just put up. It has a coherent a policy. So you need a full view on the issue of migration, diversity, whatever. Okay, second one, I would say to the mayor of Ramon, I would advise political commitment. Okay, politicians are very important. Okay. They can do a lot when they speak. They create images. This is very important. For example, we have seen lately some leaders in Europe speaking about health tourism. Okay, and this is very bad. This is creating suspicious about migrants. So we need commitment from politicians to be very sure. We are now trying to export this campaign in 2 other 10 cities in Europe, and there's one city in Poland who now they are checking out because the politician in charge is not committed. He said, oh my goodness, is this, should I talk about these issues with these citizens? Perhaps, well, I'm not sure. Our advice is yes, you have to talk about migration diversity because it's something that citizens are worried. So talk about it. If not, only the populists are going to talk with their argument. So we need some kind of different arguments.
And then I think thirdly, what was also very helpful was to engage the NGO community.
Yeah, I forgot. Yes, this is basic. Without the NGOs, with the third sector, we cannot do by ourselves. So the NGOs, they arrive where the city administration cannot arrive. So to other places. So, and I think this is basic.
Okay, so we'll take some questions from the audience. Raise your hand and maybe also introduce yourself with your name. Gentleman over here, and then second there.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Don Flynn from the Migrants' Rights Network in the UK. I wonder if you think that this public discussion about immigration is, it really is a public discussion about immigration, or if there isn't, some sense in which it's a metaphor for addressing the sense of crisis that extends right the way, across large parts of society at the moment. The sense that somewhere over the space of the last decade or so, the European model of doing politics and of doing the economy and doing welfare has hit a brick wall. And all of this is terribly complicated stuff, and it's difficult for people to express opinions, what their views are on whether quantitative easing is right or wrong. But what they do know is that there is a beautiful symbol of what appears to be going wrong with their society, and that is the fact that a lot more foreign language is being spoken on the streets. And in this context, don't we have to think more, if we are making the case for migration, don't we also have to come up with our own, frankly, populist messages about what is wrong with the broader aspects, what the nature of the crisis is that we're addressing, particularly at this time, with austerity still a defining feature of European society? And isn't that the context in which we've got to develop our arguments about migration and the rights of migrants?
Select a few, so the gentleman over there.
Amitabh Kundu, I'm professor of economics, analyze the secondary data on migration and urbanization at the national and global level. I must say that when you're talking about the, confronting the myths, the rumors, and the prejudices in this area of migration and urbanization by a better, rigorous analysis of the data, confronting and talking to them, publicizing that, I thought we are oversimplifying the issue. Why I'm saying that, the biggest myth that exists in the urbanization migration in the context of Asia is that Asia is going to repeat what Latin America did in the second half of the last century, that is massive urbanization and migration. There will be urban avalanche coming up. Epicenter of urbanization is shifting to Asia. Look at the data which is brought out by UN, World Urbanization Prospect, which shows that the Asian urbanization has slowed down considerably. There are vested interests of the different countries in Asia who would like to slow down this, evict the migrants from the urban centers. They would like to sanitize, quote unquote, the large cities, and that fits into it. So when the prejudices fit into that, their political economic framework, it's very difficult to question that. I was just thinking that would you like to address this issue of how to really question that beyond going beyond data analysis?
Okay. I don't see any other hands. One more. Okay, and then we'll take a first round.
Yeah, Christoph Meyer, City of Zurich. I think I'm interested then where is the vision, the good things, where we can get the people. I think fairness, solidarity, there's a good approach. And maybe one thing we have to talk about also, and I'm wondering what you think, is about a big value of our societies. Yeah, we're a liberal society, urban liberal society. And as liberal cities, we do have the problem that in our societies, we also give place for a lot of not liberal traditions. And we have to do it because we are liberal. But there is a kind of a tension. This tension, I think, we have to talk about more openly how we are going to deal that. I'm very proud to be in a liberal society, but this is in danger. And I think this is also in the people's head. That's where we have to give answers. I'm wondering about your answers.
Okay, so we have three distinct questions, and I think you were ready to take the first one from Don Flynn. Is this debate really about migration, or is this something else?
Was it about a consequence of an economic crisis? I think we can be a bit more optimistic than that at this point, because something quite extraordinary happened in the 5 years after the economic crisis began in 2008, quite unlike what had happened in any previous European economic crisis, which is that there was not a rise of extremism as a consequence of the economic crisis. Not one of the 28 European Union countries had an extremist party of the left or right become the government. Not one had an extremist party of the left or right become the major opposition party, in fact, either. There was a rise in small third parties, which we saw manifest itself in the European elections last week. But that rise actually didn't coincide with the economic crisis. In fact, that is part of a secular rise in support for populist right-wing parties that's been going on for several decades now. And in fact, you could argue that, in fact, it slowed down or reversed a bit during the economic crisis. The mood against immigrants did not increase during the economic crisis. In fact, in most countries, it seemed to decrease slightly. And that shouldn't be surprising, because one thing that happens during an economic crisis is you don't get immigrants coming in. Europe saw a net outflow of immigrants, in this case, emigrants, back to Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Turkey during the years after 2008. Immigrants come when the economy is doing well. And the periods when anger and intolerance toward immigrants increases the most are the periods of economic prosperity, when you have a lot of immigrants on the streets and coming in and so on. The one thing that, if you look at the various studies of what attitudes toward immigrants correlate with, the one thing they do correlate with is large amounts of immigration, which occurs during economic boom times and times of high employment. The other thing is that it tends to be dissociated toward intolerance of ethnic minorities and religious minorities around you. The people who are most intolerant of immigrants are not the people who are most intolerant of minorities around them. Britain's an interesting example. I think your polling has found this, that people in Britain are among the most skeptical in Europe about immigration, but they are also among the most tolerant in Western Europe of people of immigration descent, of ethnic and religious minorities around them. It's sort of the attitude that, my God, I don't want any more immigration from Muslim countries, but Mohammed down the street, he's a stand-up chap, totally great guy. And you're seeing that all over Europe. even as we see these fringe parties, and remember, they are never more than a fringe, rise in popularity, we see in almost every European country measures of tolerance of minorities increasing as well.
Did you want to? Okay.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. It's true because the data that where we show concerns of immigration, that does actually happen in the early 90s where, you know, we are coming out of economic crisis. So I do think there's broader issues around, well, you know, our concerns around when people tell us they're concerned about immigration, what they're actually concerned about is housing and the lack of supply of housing. But it's, you know, we're framing it on the immigrants because we see them coming in. So there are structural issues that need to be addressed, I think. And also, I think the other point that Doug was making, you know, what we find in our data is that the immigrants who've been there longer, so as you become more like the general population, therefore you become more negative about the new wave of immigrants, and that's certainly the case. But having said that, you know, in all the data that Britain, you know, we love the fact that immigrants gave her our national cuisine. You know, Indian food is the national cuisine of Britain. So, you know, we're very positive about some of the cultural aspects, but then I think there's also this sense of, you know, loss of identity. What is it to be British? What is it to be English? And I think those are quite genuine concerns. You know, people feel this change, and that, you know, it's a change that they haven't seen on a scale before. So we do need to address those concerns.
Okay, you wanted to jump in on that, and then.
Yes, briefly. The first question. I will. I think it's not only economical crisis what explains this. Fear against diversity or immigration. I totally agree with Doug. I will explain you one example. In the city of Barcelona in 2007, we had 6% unemployment. Crisis came and went up to over 20% of unemployment. We have surveys on perception of migration. In 2007, was much higher the perception of the population who fear migrants, who said migration was the first problem of the city of Barcelona. And this, among the crises, has dropped down. It's only 2% now who says that migration is the first problem of the city of Barcelona. So this seems a paradox, because in 2007, I met some specialists, and they said, oh, the crisis is coming, the unemployment is going to skyrocket, the budget cuts. Ramon, get ready, you're going to have a lot of riots in the neighborhoods. I was sweating myself. So people is going to kill themselves in the neighborhoods because of ethnic origin. They were going to compete because for scarce resources. Well, it didn't happen. We have a lot of problems, of course, many, you cannot imagine, evictions, etc. But this forecast has not happened. So I instead, for example, a very, very wealthy society like Switzerland, which only 3%, 4% of unemployment, they hold a referendum and the majority vote against migration. So it's not only economy. Perhaps the crisis is more political and social. Finally, open and societies and liberal societies. Christoph Meyer from Zurich asked this question.
Before we jump into that, maybe you wanted to comment on the...
Yeah,
yes.
On the first question about, you know, austerity, that the conversation about migration is happening in the backdrop of austerity. You know, one of the things, and, you know, since we are talking about messaging, is that what you have to really do to change the narrative on immigration is appeal to people's self-interest. You know, talk about doing the right thing and humanistic values and, you know, what have you, will produce basically a clash of normative commitments. And that's not how you will change the, you know, the debate ultimately. I think, you know, in the United States, actually, the conversation about it is good in a way, and in a way it's not good. On one hand, you know, you do hear a great deal about the economic contributions of immigrants, and that is a powerful argument to make in the American context. On the other hand, I think Howard Duncan in the earlier session was talking about how, you know, immigration has become as part of sort of a nation-building exercise. When anything becomes part of a nation-building exercise, it produces all kinds of conflicted feeling, because at the local level, it seems to people that, you know, they can't control their own demographic or their own cultural destiny, and it becomes like a clash of, you know, visions between the local and the national level. I think to some extent, the immigration debate in the United States has become polarized because it's a proxy issue for this national and this local control, local cultural control. Now, the way my vision for immigration policy is that I would like immigration to be treated the same way as foreign business is treated, which is that states compete for it. Just like they compete for business, they ought to compete for immigrants, which means actually devolving control so that people can, and states and businesses, and at the local level, employers can bring in immigrants based on their own needs and their own self-interest. I think that's, that would be an important argument to make and an important theme to explore. The second question.
Yep, we'll get into the second question in just a second. But maybe just to point out, I mean, there are some initiatives already that are doing that, and I don't know who of you was in the workshops or at the marketplace yesterday with Welcoming Tennessee. I mean, they are the ones that are making the economic argument. Now, of course, there are people that say, "Oh, you shouldn't just make the economic argument," but still, it resonates with people, and it's the first step to get them up. So I encourage you all to reach out and look those examples up also here from Welcoming America. I think, though, before we get into the other questions, the question of the narrative is really important. And Khalid Kosa, again, coming back to that, he said actually the politicians, they haven't really pointed out what the vision could be. Yet 2 weeks ago, which was really a groundbreaking speech by our federal president, Joachim Gauck, for the first time he actually said, no, we are actually not multicultural, but we're a diverse society, and it's ludicrous to think that we're not. And this was actually a strong symbol. And is this part of a narrative framing that we need to see? And how does media play into that?
I think that's been part of the problem in the UK, that we found in our sort of polling, this is about 7 or 8 years ago, a large proportion of people said they didn't really feel comfortable talking about immigration because they were worried about being classed as racist. So, there was this, and actually now the data shows, people feel we are being more open and discussive about this issue. So that, a positive step. But I do think in the UK, none of the sort of pro sort of immigration lobby, possibly the Confederation of British Industry, they want to sort of take in, they argue the case for needing immigration, has really come out and developed a strong narrative. And when we compare ourselves to actually Germany, I think there is a massive difference, because things like, the birth rate in Germany is so low, we need migrants because otherwise there will be nobody working to fund, old age. That kind of debate hasn't happened in the UK, and I think there's this sort of concern. So obviously the vacuum is filled by the anti-immigration lobby. So I think it is about the narrative, and I don't think certainly in the UK we've got there yet. And that narrative of, and also just say some of the debate about immigration is a proxy for other issues. It's about political disenfranchisement. It's about, distrust in the state. So we need to look at those issues as well.
But who should actually frame that narrative? I mean, because you heard, well, it depends who tells us the facts. We only believe it if it's someone that is close to us. How do you go about that? I mean, this is an open thought that we should keep in mind. And I don't want to... I know that we have to end on time, so I'll be the German here and also give, of course, the option for another round of questions. So if we could actually shift to the second question on the liberal order, and from Christoph Meyer. So you wanted to jump in on that?
Yeah, the third question about Christopher Meyer, he asked about the liberal and open society. Well, if those liberal societies or open societies that we all like to live, were threatened, I understand this question. But, well, I think we have to look at which are the cities with more diversity in the world. New York, London, these are open and liberal societies. They are not threatened. It's the other way around. I think diversity has brought, it's not by chance that happens this. I think here, going back a little bit to the narrative, and connecting to the name of this project, Cities of Migration, it's this double narrative you were telling. Local narrative is one, and state narrative is another one. State is worried about flow control, migration flow control. This is the big issue in Europe, Fortress Europe. Who comes in, who comes out, how? Instead, at city level, mayors are worried about other things. How do we live together in harmony? That's
like
different things.
Okay, so how do we live together in harmony? And actually focusing on jobs growth, on education, might be actually the more encompassing and inclusive way to look at that, and maybe not deal them with a larger discussion or kind of blend it out.
No, everything is connected, of course. Both debates, local and state, are connected. I'm not so naive. But the priorities of the politicians are different. And very often, these decision makers at state level, international level, they take decisions, they are not really aware of the impact at local level. And this really it's terrible for the cities.
So did you want to address the question also from the professor?
I was going to say one thing about the question about, if I understood the question correctly about migration, the connection between immigration and liberal open societies. One of the big concerns in the United States is not just about immigration, but the kind of immigration. I mean, the worry is that we want to stay a liberal, open society, but if we allow immigrants from, Islamic countries, for instance, to come in who don't share our values, well, they will come, and especially if, they gain positions of power, they will change the nature and character of a liberal, open society. And this concern has actually been a perennial concern in the United States. I mean, this was a concern that even Thomas Jefferson, who was quite pro-immigration, he used to say, well, we are not sure we want to allow immigration from monarchies to come here because they don't share our self-governance Republican values. There isn't any easy answer to it except for empirical reality that, America has had waves and waves and waves of immigration, and yet it has managed to stay fairly open and liberal, and somehow, these values are actually like stronger than the particular ethnic commitments of the people who come in. And I mean, I haven't found a very good theoretical case against it. I mean, I just keep pointing out the empirical evidence. Canada actually has done a wonderful job. The Canadian conservatives that Doug was talking about, they have actually completely changed their narrative. And, they have figured out that these open societies, liberal, progressive, limited government values, actually, they can be marketed to these immigrant groups. So, people of the Sikh persuasion from India who came to Canada at a time when there was a great deal of Sikh persecution, well, they are very attracted to religious freedom, for instance. I mean, that's a value of an open society. So the conservatives in Canada have figured out that immigrants are not necessarily hostile to these progressive open values. If you market these values to them, in a way that appeals to them, you can bring them along. So the immigrants in Canada actually vote conservative quite a bit. And I've actually, in a lot of my columns, I've been using Canada as an example for the Republican Party in the United States to figure out a way how to, market their limited government principles and openness to various ethnic groups.
Okay, don't want to lose track of the third question from the professor from India. Did you want to address it?
To the extent that I understood the question, the urbanization issues that Asian countries are facing are quite different now from the urbanization issues that the West is facing. In Asia, the urbanization is due to internal migration. And, you and I had this conversation yesterday. The reason India and China, I think, haven't urbanized at quite the pace as was expected is because they haven't fixed a certain, level of governance issue. They haven't figured out how to accommodate this massive waves of migrants who come from the rural areas to, to the urban areas. This has produced a backlash within, urban communities against rural migration. At the same time, when rural migrants' expectations are not met, it creates a feedback loop and discourages them from coming. I think till these countries solve their governance and infrastructure problems in the urban areas that allow for this urbanization to continue, it's going to be difficult for them. But I mean, that's a very different conversation from foreign migration.
Okay, well, I think you can take that outside, but be nice to each other. we'll take 1, 2, 3 more questions, and then I'll close it, because I want to be mindful of the time and not stand in between the wedding history and a story that we want to hear, of course. So, Raquel? Oh.
Okay. My name is Rin Cabral. I run Migrant and Refugee Organization in London. I've got a microphone, so there you go. I think it was just touched briefly, but you mentioned humor. And I busy myself with messages and myths and facts, and it's a very boring business. And those of us who are doing it, politicians, journalists, civil society, we're also not very funny when we're doing it. And there was a really funny example last year in London. The government paid adverts to be driven around London during the holy month of Ramadan to say to people, go home. Yeah. And, you know, the boring people complained and lawyers put in a judicial review, but the rest of the people just took a piss out of it on Twitter and started phoning the Home Office and saying, oh, can you take me from this address to that address? And it lifted the campaign into a completely different space. But I wonder, where could the funny bit be sort of taking place if all we're doing, talking about it in a serious way all the time?
Actually, why don't we use this as a last question, and you can answer about the funny bits and that you see as a way maybe to move this forward, and then we close the panel. Who's humorous among you? And daunting.
Yes. Can I ask it? Okay, thank you. So my question is really, and maybe you mentioned this and I just missed it, but it's more about who's telling the story. And so I'm wondering what media's role plays in really bringing in a different perspective. And so I felt like I heard a lot of a reactionary response and how you take these polls and then kind of figure out who from the predominant society is kind of going to deliver that message still, and not so much about how we really diversify the perspectives being presented. And I think it's very much one perspective that's being presented and the other voice is lost. And in Michigan, in South Michigan, where we are lucky in that I think we have a strong coalition of different ethnic media from the Arab community, from the Jewish community, et cetera, that work together to make sure that these stories are covered from these immigrant communities that mainstream media doesn't pick up. And so they kind of took on that role, felt it was their responsibility to start building those relationships to mainstream media. But I wonder, what is mainstream media's responsibility in making sure those stories are covered and shifting the narrative? And what role is mainstream media, I guess, taking in trying to incorporate those perspectives more?
Okay, so maybe you can combine the two questions in your final statements, and I'll start with you.
Well, I'll give you an example of using humor. This is Blanca Rosita in Barcelona. It's a comic. It's named after Woody Allen's movie, Cristina and Barcelona. Okay, you remember that? And it's a relation between a Peruvian origin woman who's taking care of an elder woman who herself is also a migrant from the south of Spain, and they have a relation, very funny relation among them. And when they talk, they talk about these issues of I was telling you, and this is done by a very famous comic writer in Spain, Gallardo. And well, we use here this humor. There's four of these outside. You can take a look. But at the end, we use also the boring thing, the data. Okay, there's 3 pages, 4 pages of comics. At the end is, did you know that? And then here we end up with the objective data. So it is possible to use humor. We also produce some videos, but you always are in the thin line. Okay. You can cross that thin line, and it's a backlash. We did some pre-tests. We had 6 videos, and we had to erase 2 videos because it didn't work out what we meant. So it is possible to do it.
Okay. On the question of humor, but also on Raquel's question.
Yeah, I don't have much to say
media.
about the question on humor, except that when you have a joke, use it. I mean, you know, what else is... I'm not sure there is any kind of like a systematic way to think about using humor. You know, it's kind of one of the spontaneous things. You think of, you know, something appropriate. A good put down is always good. to a question about the responsibility of the mainstream media, I'm always a little, I mean, I get that question in many forms a lot, and I'm always stumped by it slightly. I'm not always sure what a good response is, because one, it just seems anomalous to talk about the mainstream media as some kind of a monolith. There is this mainstream media, and if we can just get into it, we will be able to influence everybody's views and shift the needle on our agenda. It doesn't quite work that way. Partly, I'm not sure there was ever a big mainstream media, but to the extent that there was, it's been hugely, hugely fragmented now in the age of new media, where you have, blogs, and you have, 30 different television stations, and they all generate their own audience, and everybody gets their own, narrative and their own viewpoint from, these places that they choose to patronize. Within that, I have, a responsibility to my own normative commitments, as I am sure Rush Limbaugh has to his own normative commitments. And we all have, so various people in the media too have their own, their own normative commitments. For me, the challenge always is, how do you find a common ground in these competing commitments? And how do you then, change their mind and change yours as well? So that's kind of what the real issue is to me, and not about, mainstream media and what it ought to be doing.
Okay, so we'll have 2 more final statements, and you choose which ones you want to answer to, but keep it short, and thank you.
I'm the media guy, so it's all my fault. And and to some extent, this is true. I write and edit for one of the least humorous newspapers outside of Frankfurt, I think, and one that has a growing number, but still not very many people of visible minority immigrant descent writing for it. And I think the solution to this, and the way tolerance increases is not so much through campaigning, particularly not through campaigning by people like me who have liberal views, but when it comes right down to it, probably can't be trusted to transform things that much. But I think what we heard in the football debate yesterday actually was a lot closer to the way things actually transform themselves. I do think I was here in Germany during that World Cup when the Germany side had a majority of players with Turkish and Slavic surnames, much as I was living in England when you started to have a majority of the England team be not of white skin, and so on. And it makes a difference when your average guy at the pub or beer garden can point to somebody and say, well, he is unquestionably Germany or England or whatever, but doesn't look like me. That makes a huge difference. And I think part of it is when you start having people of migration descent, as they like to say here, not being the people who are in your newspaper, on your TV, yelling about immigration or talking about diversity or racism or so on, but when they're doing the ordinary things, when they're the people hosting the cooking show, or the people on the football team, or the people writing the economic reports, and so on. That's when you start to have progress, when it stops being an argument by immigrants about immigration against non-immigrants and so on, but it starts becoming a place where it's just a normal part of life.
And maybe just a shout out there to the MORI Foundation, because they have a great project called Diverse Voices, where people of migration background, descent, however you want to call it, are actually portrayed in the normal jobs as engineers, as nurses. And there were NGOs who transferred it actually to Germany, and there should be no reason why it couldn't be transferred to other cities and other countries. So it was to leave on a good note. Yeah. And
I'll be very quick. On the point of the media, what is really interesting, if you look at, in the UK we have a very, very strong national media. What's very strong, people's views of immigration are very polarised depending on which paper you read, and whether that's caused by you choose the paper that supports your political opinion or vice versa, we don't know. But what's really interesting is levels of concern from people who don't read any national media are still there. So even with the absence of media amongst these people, these concerns are there. And in terms of sort of positive representation, one of the best moments for me of the last couple of years was seeing Mo Farah of Somali, heritage representing Great Britain. So it is those positive images. Nobody questioned, well, there were a few people who questioned, whether he was British or not, but nobody there, everyone was there cheering behind him. And it is those positive, good news stories that we need to see more of.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this panel. Yes, please lend a hand.